In the beginning, food was never just food. It was land, it was labor, it was power, and long before nations spoke openly of ideology or dominance, they spoke through what they grew, what they ate, and who they allowed to eat it. To understand the struggle between China and America over food is not to start with modern trade wars or shipping containers or headlines, but with soil, migration, hunger, and fear, stretching back into the 19th century when both societies were reshaping themselves under immense pressure. In southern China, generations of farmers worked fragile land, coaxing rice from flooded paddies with techniques refined over thousands of years, feeding dense populations through discipline, coordination, and an intimate understanding of nature's limits. Across the Pacific, the United States was expanding violently westward, turning indigenous land into private property, breaking ecosystems into commodities, and building an agricultural empire fueled by grain, meat, and later industrial machinery. These two food systems could not have been more different, and yet they would collide, merge, and compete in ways that quietly shaped the modern world. When Chinese laborers first arrived in America in large numbers in the mid-1800s, they brought little with them except survival knowledge and cooking habits forged by scarcity. They cooked with scraps, stretched small amounts of protein across large meals, relied on preserved vegetables, rice, and techniques that maximized flavor without excess. To Americans accustomed to abundance, to heavy meat portions and bread as the center of the plate, this food seemed strange, even threatening. Eating habits became markers of identity, and Chinese food quickly became associated not just with foreigners, but with fears about labor, race, and economic competition. Anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States did not only target people, it targeted what they ate, how they cooked, and what their food symbolized. Yet at the same time, American cities were growing faster than their food systems could comfortably support, and Chinese cooks found a strange opportunity within rejection. They adapted. Dishes like chop suey were not inherited traditions from China, but inventions born in American kitchens, designed to satisfy American expectations while remaining cheap enough to survive discrimination. These meals used familiar meats, thick sauces, and fried textures that aligned with American tastes, while retaining an exotic label that made them marketable. In this way, food became negotiation. Chinese immigrants learned that survival depended not on preserving authenticity, but on controlling perception. The restaurant became one of the few economic spaces where Chinese Americans could operate with relative independence, and food became their shield. At the same time, Americans were unknowingly consuming a version of Chinese identity that had been carefully constructed for them, one that softened cultural difference into something edible and safe. Back in China, food was facing its own crises. The collapse of the Qing dynasty, foreign intervention, internal rebellion, and later war devastated agricultural systems that had sustained millions. Hunger became political. Whoever controlled grain controlled legitimacy. Revolutionary movements understood this well. During the Chinese Civil War and later under the Communist Party, food policy was not a background concern but a central pillar of power. Land reform, collective farming, and rationing were all framed as moral necessities, promises that the state would finally feed the people fairly. But these promises came with strict control. The Great Leap Forward, driven by ideology rather than agronomy, shattered rural food systems and led to one of the worst famines in human history. In China, food became a tool of discipline and survival, tightly linked to obedience and state authority. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from World War II as an agricultural superpower. Its farms were mechanized, subsidized, and protected. Surpluses of wheat, corn, and soy flooded global markets. Food became diplomacy. American grain fed allies, stabilized friendly governments, and pressured rivals. Aid shipments were never neutral. They carried political expectations, shaping diets and dependencies around the world. The American model of food production, large-scale, industrial, export-oriented, presented itself as efficient and modern, but it also required control of land, of labor, of global trade routes. As America exported calories, it exported influence. The Cold War transformed food into a quiet battlefield. China, isolated and suspicious of dependence, sought self-sufficiency at enormous human cost. The United States used food abundance as proof of ideological superiority. Supermarkets became propaganda. Full shelves symbolized freedom, even as they masked inequalities and waste. Chinese leaders watched carefully. They understood that hunger could topple governments faster than armies. After Mao's death, reforms opened China's economy, but food security remained non-negotiable. China would trade, industrialize, and globalize, but never surrender control over feeding its population. As China urbanized at unprecedented speed, hundreds of millions left rural farms for factory cities. Feeding them required transformation. The state encouraged productivity, hybrid seeds, fertilizer, and later biotechnology. Diets changed. Meat consumption soared. Soybeans, once minor crops, became strategic necessities. China could no longer feed itself entirely from its own land. It had to reach outward. The global food market, long dominated by American influence, suddenly had a challenger. Soy tells this story better than any other crop. In the United States, soybeans became a miracle commodity: animal feed, oil, processed food filler, fuel. In China, soy was ancient, used traditionally for tofu, sauces, fermentation. But modern China needed vast quantities to feed livestock for its growing middle class. American farms produced soy at scale, and for years, China was the largest buyer. This trade bound the two nations together in quiet dependence. American farmers relied on Chinese demand, China relied on American supply. Food became leverage, but dependence breeds anxiety. Chinese strategists understood the vulnerability of relying on foreign calories. Ports, shipping lanes, and trade agreements could be disrupted. Sanctions could starve economies without firing a shot. So China began investing aggressively in food security beyond its borders. It bought farmland in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. It invested in ports, railways, and storage. It built alternative supply chains. This was not simply economics, it was survival planning. At the same time, America's own food system grew increasingly fragile beneath its appearance of abundance. Monoculture farming depleted soil. Corporate consolidation reduced resilience. Rural communities hollowed out. The system was efficient but brittle. When supply chains were disrupted, shelves emptied faster than anyone expected. Food security, long assumed, revealed cracks. Culturally, the battle over food also intensified. Chinese cuisine, once marginalized, became mainstream, then global. American fast food spread across China, then adapted, localized, absorbed. Each nation consumed the other, literally and symbolically. Yet beneath cultural exchange lay deeper tensions. Whose standards would dominate? Whose regulations? Whose definitions of safety, sustainability, and quality? Food scandals in China, contaminated milk, adulterated oils, undermined trust and fueled state intervention. In America, obesity, diet-related disease, and environmental damage raised questions about the cost of abundance. Both nations faced crises rooted in how they fed themselves, yet their solutions diverged. China leaned toward centralized control, data, surveillance of supply chains. America leaned toward markets, even as it quietly subsidized and protected key industries. By the early 21st century, food had returned to the center of geopolitics. Trade wars were not abstract, they were measured in tons of grain, in tariffs on pork and soy, in shipping routes rerouted overnight. When America restricted exports or imposed tariffs, Chinese planners adjusted reserves. When China shifted purchases, American farmers felt it immediately. The conflict was no longer about cuisine or culture. It was about leverage over the most basic human need. What makes this struggle unique is that it is largely invisible. Tanks and missiles draw attention, grain silos do not. Yet history shows that civilizations rise and fall not on ideology alone, but on their ability to feed their people reliably. China's long memory of famine shapes every decision. America's long assumption of abundance shapes its blind spots. Each believes, in its own way, that controlling food means controlling stability, influence, and ultimately the future. And so the story of food between China and America is not a side chapter of history. It is the spine. From immigrant kitchens in 19th-century cities to massive soybean fields stretching across continents, from ration cards to overflowing supermarkets, food has been weapon, shield, and currency. It has defined who depends on whom, who adapts, and who resists. As the world grows more crowded, climate more unstable, and supply chains more fragile, this quiet contest over calories may decide more than any treaty or speech. It is a contest that began long before most people noticed, and one that continues every time a meal is grown, shipped, cooked, and consumed. As the 20th century moved toward its latter half, the contest over food between China and America entered a new phase, quieter on the surface but far more complex beneath it. This was no longer a story defined only by famine versus abundance, or isolation versus export power. It became a story of systems competing under pressure, of ideology tested by appetite, and of global consequences driven by everyday consumption. Food stopped being merely a domestic concern and became a central instrument of globalization, tying farmers, corporations, governments, and ordinary families into a single, fragile web. In China, the memory of hunger never faded. Even as reforms lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, the lesson was burned into institutional memory: instability follows empty bowls. The government treated food security as a matter of national survival, equal to military defense. Grain reserves were expanded and guarded with secrecy. Domestic production was prioritized even when it was inefficient, because reliance carried risk. The land itself became political. Arable soil was protected by law, and urban expansion was carefully balanced against the fear of losing farmland. To feed its people, China could modernize, but it could not gamble. The United States, by contrast, had grown used to the idea that food would always be there. Its strength lay not in restraint, but in scale. Farms expanded horizontally and vertically, turning agriculture into an industrial operation. Cornfields stretched to the horizon, soybeans blanketed entire states, and livestock operations grew into concentrated systems designed for maximum output. Government subsidies quietly shaped what Americans ate and what the country exported. Corn became sweetener, feed, fuel, and filler. Soy became invisible, woven into meat, oil, and processed food. The system rewarded volume over resilience, efficiency over diversity. As global trade accelerated, American food exports became a foundation of international influence. Grain shipments stabilized allies, undercut rivals, and opened markets. But they also reshaped diets worldwide, encouraging meat-heavy consumption patterns that required enormous resource input. This model was profitable, but it was not neutral. It created dependencies, environmental strain, and health consequences that would surface decades later. Still, for a long time, abundance masked cost. China watched all of this carefully. When it joined global trade institutions, it did so with caution and long-term strategy. Opening markets meant access to calories, but also exposure to volatility. Prices could spike, supply chains could be disrupted, political tensions could turn food into a weapon. So while China imported heavily, it never stopped thinking about alternatives. It diversified suppliers. It invested in infrastructure abroad. It treated food the way other nations treated oil. The soybean trade became a symbol of this uneasy interdependence. American farmers planted with China in mind. Chinese buyers planned reserves based on American harvests. The relationship appeared stable, even friendly, but it rested on mutual vulnerability. When political tensions rose, food was among the first pressure points. Tariffs on soybeans were not abstract economic moves. They were signals aimed directly at rural livelihoods and national security calculations. Farmers felt the shock in their incomes. Chinese planners felt it in their risk assessments. At the same time, China began reshaping its own food landscape. Urban consumers demanded variety, safety, and quality. Traditional wet markets coexisted uneasily with supermarkets and digital delivery platforms. Technology entered the food chain, tracking production, transport, and storage. Data became as important as fertilizer. The state sought visibility and control, aiming to prevent shortages, scandals, and unrest. Food was no longer just grown, it was monitored. In America, food became increasingly disconnected from place and season. Consumers expected everything, always. The supermarket turned into a symbol of choice, but also of excess. Waste grew alongside abundance. Health problems tied to diet rose quietly, then dramatically. Food, once a sign of national strength, began to reveal internal weaknesses. The system fed people, but it did not always nourish them. And yet, because scarcity was rare, urgency was low. Globalization linked these contrasting systems into one shared vulnerability. A drought in one region affected prices everywhere. A disease outbreak in livestock crossed borders through trade. A shipping disruption rippled through shelves continents away. Climate change intensified these stresses, making harvests less predictable and resources more contested. Suddenly, the assumption that food would simply appear looked dangerously fragile. China responded by tightening control and expanding reach. It invested in agricultural technology, alternative proteins, and overseas farmland. It treated logistics as strategy, ports and storage as extensions of national security. Food was folded into broader geopolitical initiatives, not as an afterthought, but as a core concern. The goal was not dominance in taste or branding, but insulation from crisis. The United States, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile its market-driven food system with growing instability. Farmers faced consolidation and debt. Rural communities declined. The food chain grew longer and more complex, making it harder to manage shocks. Yet the idea of food as a strategic vulnerability remained politically uncomfortable. Abundance was still part of national identity, even as cracks widened. Culturally, food continued to flow between the two nations, carrying symbols and stories. Chinese dishes evolved in American kitchens. American chains adapted in Chinese cities. These exchanges suggested familiarity, even harmony, but they existed alongside deep mistrust. Each side understood that shared consumption did not mean shared control. Behind every menu was a supply chain, and behind every supply chain was power. As the 21st century progressed, it became clear that food would be one of the defining arenas of competition between China and America. Not because either sought to starve the other, but because both understood what was at stake. Control over food meant resilience in crisis, leverage in negotiation, and stability at home. It meant the ability to endure disruption while others scrambled. The struggle is not dramatic in the way wars are dramatic. It unfolds in planting decisions, trade agreements, research labs, and shipping manifests. It shows up in what grows where, who owns the land, who sets standards, and who can adapt fastest when conditions change. It is slow, structural, and relentless. And in this quiet contest, there is no final victory, only constant adjustment. Climate, population, and politics ensure that food will remain uncertain. The nation that can feed itself reliably, adapt its system without collapse, and manage interdependence without surrendering control will hold an advantage that no weapon can replace. Between China and America, this understanding now shapes policy as surely as any doctrine. Food, once treated as background, has returned to the foreground of history. It is no longer just about taste, tradition, or trade. It is about endurance. It is about who can promise their people that tomorrow's meal will come, no matter what the world throws at them. And in that promise lies a power older than empires, and perhaps more decisive than any other. As the present era comes into view, the contest over food between China and America grows sharper, shaped less by ideology and more by pressure. Climate volatility, population demands, and political fragmentation push food systems toward their limits. What once felt like a background issue now sits at the center of strategic planning, because the margin for error has narrowed. Droughts last longer, floods arrive unexpectedly, soil degrades quietly, supply chains stretch across oceans that are no longer guaranteed to remain open. In this environment, food security becomes inseparable from national security. China approaches this reality with a long memory and a centralized hand. The state assumes instability as the default condition and plans accordingly. Stockpiles are expanded not for profit, but for shock absorption. Domestic production is protected even when it strains resources, because control matters more than efficiency. Technology is deployed to measure every stage of growth, storage, and distribution. Artificial intelligence models yields. Satellite data tracks weather and land use. The goal is not perfection, but anticipation. If disruption is inevitable, then surprise must be minimized. At the same time, China's reach outward continues to grow. Investments in ports, railways, and farmland abroad are often described in economic terms, but their logic is elementary. Grain corridors matter as much as shipping lanes. Relationships with producing nations are cultivated patiently, sometimes quietly, because food diplomacy works best when it feels mutual. The strategy accepts interdependence, but seeks to manage it on favorable terms, spreading risk across regions rather than trusting any single source. The United States confronts the same global pressures from a different starting point. Its system remains extraordinarily productive, but also increasingly brittle. Climate stress exposes the risks of monoculture. A disease in one crop can affect millions of acres. Consolidation concentrates decision-making in fewer hands, amplifying both efficiency and vulnerability. The market responds quickly to price signals, but not always to long-term resilience. Incentives reward yield today more than adaptability tomorrow. Politically, food remains a sensitive topic in America, but not always a strategic one. Shortages are rare, so urgency is episodic. When disruptions occur, they are often treated as temporary failures rather than structural warnings. Yet beneath the surface, dependence grows. Fertilizer supply, migrant labor, energy inputs, and global logistics all become points of exposure. The abundance that once defined American confidence now depends on systems beyond its full control. Between the two nations, trade continues, but trust erodes. Each tariff, each restriction, each inspection delay carries symbolic weight. Food becomes a language of signaling. What is allowed to move, and what is slowed or stopped, reflects not just economics, but intent. The global market absorbs these signals and adjusts, but the cumulative effect is fragmentation. Regional blocks emerge. Redundancy replaces efficiency. The era of seamless global food flow gives way to guarded corridors. Meanwhile, the cultural dimension of food takes on new meaning. What people eat reflects what systems can support. Diets shift not only because of taste, but because of cost, availability, and policy. Protein becomes political. Land use debates intensify. Questions once confined to agriculture ministries enter public discourse. Who should grow food? How much land should be preserved? Whether technology should replace tradition. These debates echo differently in China and America, but they arise from the same pressures. In moments of crisis, the contrast sharpens. When supply chains falter, China's centralized reserves provide stability, but at the cost of flexibility. When markets swing, America's system adapts quickly, but unevenly, protecting some while exposing others. Neither model is invulnerable. Each carries strengths shaped by history and weaknesses born of the same. What emerges is not a simple rivalry, but a shared predicament. The planet can no longer absorb inefficiency without consequence. Water scarcity, soil loss, and rising temperatures impose limits that ignore borders. In this context, control over food does not mean domination in the old sense. It means the capacity to endure constraint without collapse. It means coordination between production, consumption, and conservation. The question of who controls the world's food may ultimately be less important than how control is exercised. Power used to hoard creates instability elsewhere, which eventually returns. Power used to stabilize can preserve peace, but requires cooperation that competition undermines. China and America stand as the largest actors in this system, not because they command every field or market, but because their choices ripple outward, shaping incentives and outcomes for others. History suggests that food has always been a quiet driver of global change. Empires expanded along grain routes. Revolutions ignited when bread ran out. Alliances formed around shared sustenance. What is different now is scale. Billions depend on systems that must function continuously, without pause. Failure is no longer local. It is planetary. As the future unfolds, the struggle over food between China and America will continue, not as a single confrontation, but as an ongoing negotiation between abundance and restraint, openness and control. The outcome will not be declared in a treaty or a battlefield. It will be visible in fields that endure heat and drought, in cities that remain fed during crisis, and in societies that trust their systems enough to remain stable. In the end, food does not choose sides. It responds to soil, water, labor, and care. The nations that understand this, and shape their power accordingly, will find that control over food is not about conquest, but about stewardship. And in a world growing more uncertain by the year, stewardship may be the most decisive form of power left.